So good morning, everyone. My name is Patricia Wyrick. I am the Rural Forestry Program Coordinator with the South Dakota Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources. If you talk to us, we like the short acronym DANR now. DANR has teamed up with Penn State Extension and South Dakota Family Forest Association to present this webinar, which is the first of a series for educational carbon. Due to the interest in this workshop, this is being recorded for future viewing through the DANR YouTube page. All participants' videos have been turned off to save on the bandwidth and assist with the presentation. Participants are allowed to turn on their microphones, but we request the microphones are turned off during the presentation portion to allow for a better experience. Any questions can be placed at the chat box. If you are a Society of American Forester or are looking for continuing education credits, this is pre-authorized. Please put your information into the chat so that I can make sure it is in the attendance. We will address any questions that are placed in the chat box or allow you to during the question and answer portion at the end of the meeting. So today's presentation is called Forest Carbon and will be presented by Penn State Extension educator Calvin Norman. Calvin is a Wisconsin native and earned his Master's of Science in Forestry and Resources from Clemson State University. He is a co-manager of 10,000 acres of forest and he understands the issues in maintaining and growing timber. He has also worked a lot in carbon and I'm really happy that he's agreed to present today.
All right, thanks, Patricia. Just a slight correction there. It's no big deal. But I used to be an industrial forester. No longer. I am now just an extension educator. So that it takes a lot of stress off the old plate to not have to run timber and get calls from loggers at 4 a.m. about a truck got stuck or they flipped the machine. So it's a lot less stressful life now, though.
Thank you.
So thank you all for attending. I know this is a very developing issue. I wouldn't even say it's a growing, it's a nice little forest joke to start out the day. It's a growing issue, and it's a growing, these carbon markets are really developing and growing. So I work with Melissa Cry. You guys are going to hear from her next week about the market side and all the economics. She's an economist, whereas I am more of a forester and I work with landowners a lot. Well, I'm not more of a forester. She also has forest degrees, so we're both foresters, but she does the economic side. She plays with all the math stuff. So today's talk is an introduction to forest carbon. So this is geared for everyone, from just, your standard landowner to folks in the Forest Service. Melissa and I have done a number of these talks. We've talked to all kinds of different folks. A couple of weeks ago, we were talking to the folks at University of Kentucky. Last week, I talked to a landowner group in southern Pennsylvania here. So we talk to all kinds of folks, and if you're maybe more on the professional spectrum and you're like, well, I already know this stuff, just remember there are lots of different folks in this call. So now I live in Pennsylvania now. I used to live in Michigan. I used to work in Michigan. I used to live in South Carolina. I'm gonna be honest, I've never lived in South Dakota. I have visited, but from what I remember, you guys have a very different state. 97% of South Dakota is Great Plains, and only like 1.3-ish million acres are forest. That's over here in the Black Hills. So we're going to address Great Plains carbon stuff, but I'm going to be honest, I am not a rangeland scientist. And when I get into the Great Plains, I'm like, wow, this is neat. There's no trees though. So I'm going to touch on 97% of the state, but it's going to be extraordinarily light. And if you want to know more about range carbon, I can, we can help you find somebody, but that's not going to come from me. We're going to brush on it just real lightly, though. Okay, so before we get into the meat of the topic, let's talk about why, all of this interest. So we know that climate change is real, it's human caused, and the majority of pollution it comes from carbon dioxide. Now, I've already told you I'm a forester. I'm not a climate scientist, so there are lots of other chemicals and stuff out there that do impact the atmosphere and the climate, like methane, but I can't really speak to those. I know a little bit about carbon here, so this talk is going to be mainly focused on carbon. And also, trees don't really pull methane out of the air. So again, we're going to talk a lot about carbon today. Now, the interest in carbon is because of these carbon markets. Melissa's going to get into more of that next week, but we're just going to lightly brush on here. These carbon markets and carbon sequestration are just a stepping stone in solving the climate crisis. They do not end the climate crisis. They buy us time to make more radical changes. So this isn't going to solve the crisis. It just buys us a little bit of time. Okay, and now I'm going to introduce a couple of terms here. So you folks may have heard some of these terms before, but we're just going to define them here. The first one is sequester. Sequester is like the action verb in getting carbon. So that's when you're actually capturing carbon from the air. And then the next one is storage. And so that's when you've got it locked down. So I kind of think of it, when you're sequestering something, you're going out, you're grabbing it. And then when you're storing it, you got it in the safe. It's not going anywhere. So that's the big difference here. These terms are often used interchangeably, but they're not interchangeable. So that's why we want to define those here today. Okay, now we can actually start talking about carbon sequestration and carbon stuff. Now, I am sure some of you have heard or read about some really interesting ideas for how to sequester carbon. This is just a light Google that I've done on some news articles. We got everything from turning atmospheric carbon into diamonds. People want to pump it underground, all kinds of different things. But unfortunately, most of these are just newspaper articles. And I would like to present to you something that we know works and is real, and those are trees. So just here's a light comparison again between some of the proposed solutions. Here's one where we're pumping carbon underground into old gas mines or old coal mines. Now here, to borrow from my rhetoric friends, the medium is the message. This is a conceptual drawing, and this is a photo of what exists. There's a lot of talk about these things that don't exist, whereas trees exist today, and they've existed for a couple billion years, depending on, what, fossil expert you're talking to. It kind of shifts, but they've existed for a long time, and they're incredibly good at pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. They are the perfect carbon capture. I'm not going to call it a machine, but they're the perfect carbon capture technology. Trees have spent billions of years pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, so they've really perfected it, and they've got it down. The other great thing about using trees to sequester carbon is there's no construction cost. You don't have to do any permitting. You just put them in the ground and they grow. Or, in the most cases, they just grow on their own in a lot of places. Here in Pennsylvania, if you want to keep a place from being forested, you have to prevent it from being forested. I do a lot of work on wildlife stuff, and we're losing our early successional habitat because, we just can't help but grow freaking trees everywhere. So, unlike some of these other ideas and plans for like pumping carbon underground, trees exist, they grow on their own, they're self-replicating, they're unbeatable. The other really nice thing about forests is we have this established science of forestry. It has been practiced for hundreds of years. We got really great long-term studies. Folks learn forestry everywhere from Germany, US, Russia, Canada. It's very established, global. We know about how trees work. We have the algorithms, or we have the equations already to tell you to predict tree growth. We have an established industry around trees, so you don't have to build a market at the same time as you're trying to do the science. And we have dedicated land-based and land management agencies already in place. Trees they're already here. The infrastructure is already here. It's just going to change the machinery a little bit to make forests sequester more carbon and to really focus on forest carbon. The other great thing about trees is not only they're good at sequestering carbon, they can also store it for a long time. Now, again, we're going to go back to what we just talked about. Sequestering is pulling out of the atmosphere, and storage is holding it. Some of these, ideas for carbon storage, they're really energy intensive to capture the carbon. Whereas trees, they don't cost any energy. They just do it on their own, And they provide all kinds of secondary benefits. I was just telling Patricia that I was out hunting earlier. I hunt in forests, because that's where deer like to hang out. Also, trees provide oxygen, biodiversity, recreation. I mean, this list goes on and on and on and on. So, trees are here, they exist, they're great, and that's why people are talking about forests when it comes to carbon capture. It's just another thing that trees can do. A saying that I've heard about trees and about forests are, trees are the answer, what is your question? You know, and here trees can help us with the climate crisis. So that's why we're talking about them. So we're all on board with trees as one of our steps to solving the climate crisis. So let's talk about why we're focused on trees. How do they capture and sequester that carbon? Well, they do it by simple existence. They capture carbon through photosynthesis. So when trees do photosynthesis, or just any plant, what they do is they capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere with a little bit of sun and a little bit of water and some nutrients. They lock that carbon into sugar, and that sugar that makes up the plant, and that's what the plant uses to, respirate and exist. That is where the carbon is sequestered. Now, they also do release some oxygen, which is, pretty handy if you're a person or an animal or, anything that's not a plant. Oxygen is pretty handy. If you're more of a numbers person, less of a diagram person, here's the equation for photosynthesis. So you got your carbon dioxide here, a little bit of water, put them together, boom, a little magic happens. You make some tacos here. Big taco fan. So that's, that's what we're using to represent sugar, because I like tacos more than cake, to be honest. So you get one sugar molecule, which is C6H12O6, and then you get some oxygen. Again, handy for us, not so handy for plants. So this carbon right here is where all of the sequestration and the storage happens. This is it right here. This is why we're talking about trees. This is why BP is thinking about trees and carbon sequestration, because of photosynthesis. Now, plants do release some carbon dioxide, and they release it in their roots. So up here in the above ground portion of trees, this is where photosynthesis happens. But roots are underground, so roots can't photosynthesize. So when they need to grow or capture nutrients, they respirate like you and I do, and so that's how they release a little bit of carbon dioxide. And so, I'm sure some of you folks are farmers, and if you flood a field, you're going to kill the plant, and that's because the roots literally drown, just like you or I would. They don't have any oxygen, and so they die. So this is where they do release a little bit of carbon. Okay, so we're now all on board. We understand how photosynthesis works. So let's break a tree down into kind of its constituent parts. Now, some botanists might be a little upset at me that I took the whole big beautiful tree and I broke it down into these three parts. We have wood, we have roots, and we have leaves. Now, I think that there's a chat function, so I just want you all to just in the chat real quick, just out of the three options, where do you think the trees store most of their carbon? I'm not sure if anyone's using the chat here. I'm going to give you 2 seconds, and then we're going to keep going here, because we got a lot to cover. Well, trees store most of their carbon in the wood. It's the #1 place they do it, and it's long term. That's the great part about trees. And then we use that wood for all kinds of stuff. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so I'm going to stop talking about that. The second biggest pool of carbon are the roots. And then again, that's long term, and that's how we get some of the underground forest soil carbon. And then leaves are our last one. Now, I fixed most of my pictures here to be, South Dakota focused, but I missed this one. There's a red maple here. This is, one of the most common trees here in Pennsylvania. And our leaves are pretty short-lived. On deciduous trees, they lose them every year. You guys have a lot of coniferous trees, and they still replace those leaves, but they last a little bit longer. But wood is where most of our sequestration happens. Now, trees do release carbon, and they release them. They release it mainly when they die. Just like all things, they die and they break down, and that decomposition is where carbon is released. So in our management, when we're thinking about trying to maximize carbon stored and sequestered in forests, we want to avoid decay. Now, decay is good because it does incorporate some of that carbon into the soil, and that's kind of a longer term source, or a longer term storage than plants, because it's easier to decompose things that are above ground than underground for the most part. So it's important that we think about decay. All right, now we're going to take everything we just learned and put it kind of like, let's look at how a forest works here. So in our forest, we have our lovely ponderosa pines. We also have some nice understory trees, or understory plant species, and we got some wildlife. So in this forest, when we're thinking about carbon, and when carbon markets are functioning, mostly what we're talking about in forest carbon markets are trees. Now, the soil stores carbon. We're going to talk about that more in the next slide. But it's really hard to measure forest carbon, the carbon stored in forest soils, so that we just discount that entirely. So we're thinking mainly trees here. Now, wildlife is really important. It's half of my job. Unfortunately, wildlife is a poor carbon sink, and they emit carbon. When you exhale and when wildlife exhales, it is emitting carbon dioxide, and they're also short-lived. Also, they break down really fast when they die. I mean, you know, if a deer gets hit in the side of the road here in Pennsylvania, it's gone in like 3 months, broken down to decompose, whereas trees are around for decades. We also don't think about understory plants because they're pretty small when compared to trees. And for the most part, you know, they're annuals or perennials, and so they're not around anywhere near as long as trees are. So in forest carbon stuff, we're just talking trees. So how much carbon is stored in a ponderosa pine forest? I found a great little diagram here. So here is a comparison of carbon in a young ponderosa pine stand. This is a 14-year stand versus a 50 or 250-year-old stand. So in South Dakota, most of your carbon is being stored in standing trees, about 10,000 tons per acre. Now, underground, you get about 5,000. So your forest soils are really important, but that standing tree is really important. Now, your forests do emit some carbon, and that's coming from soil respiration and microbes breaking stuff down. The dead wood on the forest floor does store some, but mainly it's in these standing trees. When you look at a young forest, you know, it's also sequestering carbon, but it's not sequestering anywhere near as much carbon as this older forest is. So, you know, this is just something to keep in mind here, is these larger trees, they're going to hold more. Okay, so let's talk about how forests actually grow here. So this is kind of a theoretical model that most people that I've interacted with they think of forests like, all right, so you started, you know, year 0 and like your trees start growing and they grow and they just grow forever, right? That's kind of, and you know, as they grow, they sequester carbon, and then they kind of get old and the carbon sequestration falls off as they get old and trees start dying, they start emitting carbon, and just stuff slows down. That's not usually how forests work. This is not a realistic model. Oh, also, our young forests, you know, these younger forests are where we're doing most of that sequestration, you know, because they're young and trees are growing, and there's not really much mortality, versus the older forests where there's more mortality and stuff levels out. But this is an unrealistic model. How forests actually work are more like this. You know, they grow for, you know, an amount of time, and then a disturbance happens, you know, be it mountain pine beetle, be it fire, be it a windstorm, be it a drought, be it a flood, you know, all kinds of stuff happens, and that changes your carbon budget. So, you know, you can see if, you know, in this fire scenario, we kind of had to blow through, you know, knock some trees down, but then it bounced back. Or, you know, maybe we get the pine beetle comes through, just kills all the trees. Then you got to restart your stand. And this is really a lot better model for thinking about how forests work. So just keep this in mind, folks. Like, you know, going forward, forests are not a static thing. They change all the time, and that changes their carbon. And so that's why we're going to talk a little bit more about harvesting. But, you know, the trees are not ever living or ever growing. They die. Stuff happens. But they do come back. Okay, so we got our models in mind. Now let's talk about forest types. So for our foresters out here, you're going to be kind of frustrated because I really simplified forest ages. So we have young forests right here. We got our mature forest, and we got our old growth forest. Now, again, I just want you to think, just guess in your mind where most carbon sequestration happens. So that's that act of capturing carbon, not holding carbon. Okay. All right. So now we're going to find out. Our young forests are pretty good at sequestering carbon. They grow really fast, so they're capturing a good amount of carbon. However, they do die pretty frequently. Young trees, you know, seedlings are born to die. Our mature forests have, you know, these ponderosa pines have a pretty low trees per acre, where the seedlings you get like thousands per acre. So you're going to get a lot of mortality. But they give replace really fast. The other thing about the young trees is because of their small size, they don't store a lot of carbon. They're good at sequestering, bad at storing it. It's kind of your wrap up on young trees. Now, our mature forests are they're good at, this is kind of like optimal sequestration versus storage balance. They grow a little bit slower, but they're larger, so they're able to pull more carbon dioxide and sequester it pretty well. There is some mortality in these mature forests, but it's kind of overwhelmed by how much they're sequestering. These are large trees, so they're really good at storing carbon, and they've been holding it for a long time. Our old growth forests, on the other hand, are not good at sequestering carbon. Old growth forests are incredibly important for a number of things, but we should not rely on them for sequestering carbon. Again, that's the act of capturing it. And that's because by definition, old growth forests do not have any net productivity, so they're not adding on growth, which is what you need for carbon sequestration. They're kind of flatline. That's one of the key definitions of an old growth forest is you're not growing any more than you're dying. You're pretty close to zero. They're really important when it comes to carbon storage, though. That's because they have so much carbon stored up in those big standing trees and in that decayed material and also in those forest soils. So old growth forest, really good storage, not a great sequesterer, but very important for all kinds of other ecosystem services. Okay, so we got another quiz for you. I bet you guys didn't think this would be so quiz heavy. And then we want to compare forest types. Which one of these forests is going to be the best at sequestering carbon and storing carbon? All right, so some folks, I'm sure, thought the rainforest was going to be good. Wrong answer. While things grow really fast, they decay really fast. So the rainforest and these tropical forests release a lot of carbon because decay happens so rapidly. Also, their soils aren't super great at storing carbon because there's so much rain, minerals just get drained right through them. So they grow a lot, but they're not good at storage. They're not what we want to focus on if we're kind of trying to get the most carbon out of the atmosphere. Boreal forests, other hand, they kind of have the opposite problem. They have really slow growth, but they also have really slow decay. So there's a bunch of carbon banked in these soils here and in that peat, and it's not going really anywhere, but it takes a long time to add to that in a significant way just because these trees are growing so poorly. I mean, these are all black spruce, and this is like the happiest of black spruce looks, and it's not really big. They're not growing really fast. Our temperate forests, on the other hand, that's here in Pennsylvania, that's you guys in South Dakota. This is, where we want to focus when we're talking about managing for carbon and really getting the most carbon sequestration possible. And that's because we have, moderate growth. It's not as fast as in the tropical rainforest, but we got some good growth. We got some good growing seasons, and we have like much slower decay compared to the rainforest. A tree in the ground in Pennsylvania is going to sit here for like 50, 60 years easy. Same for South Dakota. It's going to sit there for a long time. So that is, while it's no longer sequestering carbon, it's a really good sink for a long time. Whereas in the rainforest, it's not going to sit around. And in the boreal forest, it's going to take a long time to grow a big tree. So we got the kind of the best of both worlds. So that's why we have a focus on temperate forests. We're going to kind of wrap up our forest section, and then we're going to go to the wood products. But here's what our key takeaways are. 1, trees. That's when we're talking forest carbon, we're talking trees. We're talking live growing trees. That's where we're getting our best carbon sequestration and storage. The forest soil is very important, but we're focused on trees. We also, when we're managing forests for carbon, we want to focus on those young and mature forests because that's where our sequestration is happening versus our old growth, which is not sequestering carbon. It is doing a lot of other really important things. So we don't go cut the old growth down and say that we're doing to sequester carbon. No, it's very important, but we want to make sure we're growing lots of new forests. And also out west, you got to prevent catastrophic wildfire. If you burn this whole thing down, you'll release a bunch of carbon. I'm going to talk about that more in a second, but we want to make sure we got as many of these growing trees as possible, and we got as few fires burning everything down to below the topsoil. Okay, so let's talk growing carbon. I used to be an industrial forester, and I just love watching these machines work in the woods. It's so much fun. If you haven't seen, a big processor or a feller buncher at work in the woods, you got to check it out sometime. It's the most enchanting thing in the world. So how do we grow carbon? Well, I've kind of simplified it down to 3 pretty easy things. Well, they're easy to present on. In real life, they're much harder to do. 1, we need to keep forests as forests. Suburbs are no good at sequestering carbon. Forests, excellent. The second thing we need to do is we need to protect the health of the forest. We need to make sure they're functioning. And then our third thing, and this is why it's the last one, because it's kind of tough, is to encourage growth in those forests. So that's where we were sequestering the most carbon possible. So how do we keep forests? Well, if I could answer that question right now, I honestly wouldn't be here. I would be banging on policy doors everywhere and changing that. But it's long and slow, and it's through things like this. We need to make sure everyone has a relationship with the forest, so we value forests for what they are, and we're not, knocking them down. We're not paving paradise. We want to make sure we're keeping paradise, and we're keeping those beautiful ponderosa pine forests. Now, that means legacy planning for a lot of folks. If you have forest, it's important that you make sure it's forest in the future. I know it's really tough to think about our, inevitable death. I got a little dark there for a second, but it's going to happen. So make sure you have a plan for it and that it's going to stay forested. Here at Penn State, we got a lot of folks who help with legacy planning. I'm sure in South Dakota, you guys got the same thing. And if you don't, give us a call here and we'll help you get it figured out, or I'll send you back to folks in South Dakota. But here in the U.S., development is the largest threat to our forests. We see it a lot here in Pennsylvania with parcelization. So little forests get cut into smaller and smaller chunks, and eventually they get clear cut and turned into homes. And folks gotta have a place to live, but I sure would hope that we weren't knocking down nice forests to house people. And then we also keep forests by having a financial incentive for forest landlords to maintain those forests. Some of that is through timber harvesting, as I got some wood over here stacked up. Sometimes it's through carbon markets. The federal government also has a number of programs. State governments have a number of programs to help incentivize forest owners to do good forest management, and that's all very important. Okay, now this next thing seems a little bit counterintuitive, but I want to make sure that we are not planting forests everywhere. There are a lot of people out there who are just talking, let's put a bunch of trees in the ground, and that is not the answer. We cannot plant our way out of this. And the reason why is, pretty clear in this picture. This is in the Gobi Desert in China, and they are trying to plant forests in the desert. And I don't live there and I don't work there, but I sure don't think that's probably going to work. And when large plantings fail, you have a large release of carbon dioxide, because all of those trees or all of those shrubs are going to die. And that's the release of carbon dioxide. And then you also release carbon dioxide, getting them out there, putting them in the ground, growing them. All of that gone to waste. So we want to make sure that we're maintaining good natural landscapes. In the Great Plains, we want to keep that Great Plains. We don't want to try to plant that to, eucalyptus or something like that. Keep the Great Plains, keep the ponderosas. Trees grow, we know where trees grow really well, and it's not the best idea to just be shoving trees everywhere. Another problem that happens with these large plantings is folks tend to, they use species that aren't native to an area. We get in our heads, that, this plant from the U.S. Actually in China, they plant a lot of American trees. And so it's like, this black locust from the U.S. is going to grow really well here. It's going to grow much faster than our native species. So let's put that in the ground. And we've been burned so many times moving, excuse me, buddy. I'm sorry, my cat just came in. He wanted to announce himself. We've been burned a lot of times putting random trees, random plants in the ground. And we know we gotta stop doing that. Additionally, we're changing this ecosystem. And while this ecosystem here doesn't look that friendly to me, if you're a Bactrian camel, that's where you gotta go. And they're incredibly endangered. So let's not screw around with ecosystems that are already working. And then we run into all kinds of problems with land rights with First Nations and Indigenous peoples. Large plantings by places, people who aren't from the area, they tend to run right over First Nations, and it's not good when that happens. There was a conflict between India and Bangladesh last year about they just put a bunch of trees in a conflicted area, and then the folks from Bangladesh who claimed the land ripped them out, and it was a whole thing. It's like, we're not going to solve these issues by just throwing trees at every problem. We got to make sure we're doing good ecosystem management and working with people who live there. Okay, so we're not going to plant trees everywhere, but we're going to keep our forests. Now, the other thing we're going to do is we're going to protect our forest health. So, first thing you guys got to do is you got to prevent catastrophic wildfires. Fire is important to the ecosystems of South Dakota and the West, but we got to make sure we're not burning it down through the dirt. When you're getting those huge fires that burn off like the top 4 inches of topsoil, that's real bad. We don't want that. It releases all kinds of carbon, and then we have all kinds of issues planting, getting forests back into those areas. So we want to make sure we're preventing that, doing prescribed fire, thinnings, fuels management. Not a West fire expert, so I'm not going to dig into that. You guys have plenty of those folks. Listen to those folks. The other thing we got to do is we got to keep invasive species out of our forests. One of the biggest issues we have in Pennsylvania are we got 100+ invasive species that just disrupt all the functionings of our ecosystems. They kill trees, they prevent regeneration, they are in heavily invaded forests. There's like 4 plants in the understory, and they're Japanese barberry, Japanese stiltgrass, multiflora rose, and autumn olive, and that is not a functioning forest. We need all of our native plants because there are so many little relationships that we don't understand. And when you lose natives, you have problems. And you got to watch out for forest pests like this emerald ash borer. I know you guys got devastated by that emerald ash borer. We're devastated by it, too. I believe the emerald ash borer has killed something like 3.3 billion trees since it was introduced. That's a huge carbon release. We want to make sure we're keeping those out. Here in Pennsylvania, we have a spotted lanternfly that we're working on combating. It's really much better if we can stop those from getting in, to our ecosystems rather than trying to fight them. So that's a little bit we got to do some changes in policy and trade stuff, but if you see an invasive, make sure you knock it out as fast as you can. And then whenever you see it, just like I was saying, whenever you see invasives, knock them back and have a plan for what's gonna, if they come to your forest, what you're gonna do and how you're gonna manage them. And now we get to timber harvesting. In forestry, we talk a lot about harvesting timber, but if you're a forest landowner, you do it once, twice, maybe in your lifetime, just because trees operate at a different scale than most people do. So when you manage a forest for carbon, the first thing you want to do is you want to maintain that forest. And then if you've got a good growing forest, you can kind of manage it to maximize carbon. So here's just like a hypothetical model of how we would do it here on the East Coast. So we let our forest grow up a little bit, and then as it kind of peaks here, we're kind of getting into more of that storage phase. We're going to shelter wood it, and we're going to reset our carbon levels, and then it's going to go up, and we're going to do that again and again and again, and just until the chainsaw rusts out, pretty much. And that's because we're having a bias towards our young forest, and we're resetting that age where we're getting the most sequestration possible out. Now, this is not to say that we got to prevent things from growing old growth, or we got to cut down old growth. Not at all. We want to make sure we have old growth and we're maximizing it where possible. We have it and we're keeping it and we're protecting it where possible. Again, on the East Coast, we have hemlock woolly adelgid that's just wrecking our old growth, and it makes me sad to think about. But where we have it, we want to keep it. But by maximizing growth, we're maximizing our carbon sequestered, and we're also preventing decay. We're preventing decay by creating wood products, which we're going to talk about in a second. We also want to make sure that we're having good practices in the woods. And our carbon management usually is almost the same as forest management, just the standard forest management, but with an eye, it's really very close to ecological forest management here in the East Coast. It might be a little different for you folks. We have a later webinar on that, so I'm not going to dig into it too much here. But you might have slightly longer rotations just to make sure you're hitting that peak of sequestration. We also want to make sure we're minimizing soil damage. And again, that's because those those soils store a lot of carbon, so we want to make sure we're not hurting those. And then if you're leaving trees, like in this harvest here, we're not damaging any trees left behind, so that way we can get the fastest regeneration possible, and we can get back up into that peak sequestration. So I kind of preface it a little bit, but let's talk about wood products. Now here we have Notre Dame. It burned a couple of years ago, and that was incredibly sad, but it also provided us with a great illustration of what the value of wood products. See this ash right here, this big smoke plume? This is all carbon sequestered from like the 1500s, or no, sorry, the 1700s when these oaks were put up here. This is really old carbon getting back into the atmosphere. And that's kind of the power of wood products. We get these wood products like this table here. This is my great grandpa made this table, and it's been in my family for like 100+ years, whereas my cat has been in the family for 4 years. She's not a good place to store carbon. Table is. So it's a long-term sink. This white oak would have decayed a long time ago in the forests of Tennessee, whereas right now it's hanging out in my living room in Pennsylvania. Also, by harvesting that white oak, we help the forest to thrive, and we provided a financial incentive to the forest owner to keep it forested. So this table is just hitting on all kinds of good places. And the other thing is we get a substitution effect. So the substitution effect is when you replace, one thing that would have emitted a lot of carbon dioxide in the creation, like a glass table or a steel table, or maybe wild and crazy like a brick or concrete table. Like all of those, creating that and using that resources releases carbon dioxide, whereas using this wooden table stores it. Now there's some conflicting research about how much is stored in wood products, but wood products are really great at doing these other things, keeping our forests and preventing decay. So it's got power and it's got importance, even if it's not the most important thing for storing carbon. And it also helps keep your relationship with the forest. If you wake up every day and you see a wood cabinet and you think about how beautiful that wood is, you're going to protect that forest a little bit more. The other, we talked about that. So the substitution effect is really important, and there's some very interesting research going on with that. And we're going to have Kylie Clay come on later. I think she's coming in December to talk about that. So she's going to really dig into that. It's going to be a very interesting presentation. But just a little fact I want you all to take away from this is the concrete releases about 8% of the world's CO2. So if we can replace a lot of that concrete with wood, we're really cutting down on carbon release. So let's wrap things up on the wood product side, and then we'll get into the Great Plains stuff. So the most important thing for managing for carbon is to keep forests. Then when we got our forests, we want to make sure they're healthy and they're thriving. And that's kind of the most of it. And if you got a healthy, thriving forest, you can harvest it, to capture that carbon and to provide incentive to maintain forests. So we want to make sure we're doing everything sustainably, and that's why we have forestry. It's why your foresters exist, and we all, when we're managing land, we're working with foresters, right? Right. Okay, so wood products are very important, and that substitution effect can be pretty powerful. So let's talk about somewhere where we're not going to get wood products out of, and what is most of South Dakota, which are the Great Plains. Now, like I said, I am not a rangeland expert, so this is going to be very brief. South Dakota has a lot of good folks who do a lot of rangeland work, and their research is, and they know a lot more about it. So this, again, brief, and if you have questions about this, I'm probably going to push it towards those folks. But we're going to address it really quick because it is the majority of the state, so we can't totally ignore it. Okay, so everything we just learned about forest carbon, besides photosynthesis, we're going to throw it out. We're just going to throw it all out. It was really fun for me to learn about carbon dynamics and the Great Plains because I was like, whoa, this is like a lot of not what I think about when I do forest carbon stuff. So in your Great Plains, 90% of the carbon is stored underground here in the soil. And that is, it's stored from, in plant roots and then also as plants break down and decompose into the soil. So right here, underground is where all the carbon is. Whereas in forests, most of it is up here in the big trees. So this is why it was really hard for me to, it was really interesting for me to learn about. Also, what's really interesting about the soil in, the carbon in the soil is most of it is like almost chemically inert. And so it's in a form that's hard for bacteria to really get into. And only about 15% of it can actually like really be released by bacteria just because of the way that it is chemically. So the Great Plains are a really great place to hold carbon for a while. And how most of that, sequestration is happening is in the plants here. And a lot of it is kind of like almost permanently locked up unless there's like, a massive like disturbance, like a flood that takes away a bunch of topsoil or, you get a fire that is burning through soil and then we have problems. But a lot of it's pretty permanently locked up. So again, I'm not a rangeland scientist, so this is really kind of quick stuff here. But as far as I could tell, the main threats to the plains carbon, are things that are going to threaten this right here, our grasses and our soil. So the invasion of woody plants, the junipers, is an issue. A lot of that is coming through fire suppression, and then also some of it is climactic. As we are increasing CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, we're making the environment less friendly towards these grasses and more friendly towards warm season plants and woody plants. And that's because these grasses are C4 plants, and so how they do photosynthesis is a little bit different than the C3 plants, which are woody plants. How that C3 and C4 works is a whole different thing. That's some deep botany stuff, and we can talk about that if you folks got questions. But you can also look it up. But it's the C3 versus C4 plant is where CO2 concentrations are causing an issue. And we see a similar thing in the Serengeti. It's going from a grass-dominant ecosystem to a shrub-dominant ecosystem, which is incredible to think about. Additionally, climate change is gonna negatively impact these plants. They are adapted to certain precipitation regimes and certain climate, temperature regimes. And as those change around, it's going to cause problems. For example, here in Pennsylvania, we are seeing the same amount of precipitation over the year, but how it's coming has changed. We're seeing fewer rain events, and those rain events are getting stronger. So we're seeing more flooding, and the water's running through our forests a lot quicker. Also, we're seeing less snow, so we're getting we're losing that like spring green up and like, when our vernal ponds would fill up, because it's kind of just flooding and sheeting off. And that causes problems for our plants, especially, these grasses and forbs, which are a little bit more delicate than trees. they're going to be negatively impacted by climate change and the shifting phenology. Phenology is natural timing. So as that changes with temperature and precipitation changes, plants are slower to adapt to that, which is going to be an issue. Additionally, soil loss has been a big problem for the Great Plains. I mean, we've all heard of the Dust Bowl, but like there are other things that cause soil loss, and that's 90% of the carbon is stored in the soil. So when you lose it, you lose your battery, and you're losing your ability to really store carbon. Excuse me. Invasive species are a huge problem. I mean, the brooms and all of those all those plants are really disrupting the native cycles in these prairies. So we got to make sure we're keeping those out. And just like in forests, land use changes also threatening these plains. If you turn the Great Plains into subdivisions, you lose your ability to sequester and store carbon. So we got to make sure we're keeping the plains, just like we're keeping forests. So just a little wrap up on Great Plains stuff. The carbon is stored in the soil, not in the plants. We're not really looking at these, we're looking down below. We want to make sure we're restoring and maintaining any rangeland we have. We want to make sure we're maintaining functioning plant communities. We do that by restoring fire to the landscape and by keeping out invasive and woody species. There's all kinds of stuff out there about like different grazing regimes. I am not qualified to talk about that, so I'm not going to do that. I have a wildlife degree, so usually when I work with animals, they're free range and they're running around doing their own thing. And kind of like managing grazing stuff is not all what I'm trained to do. So if you have questions about managing that kind of stuff, we got to find someone else to do that. But just to wrap the talk up here, we ran through carbon cycling in forests, we ran through wood products and managing forest growth, and we also managed to touch on the Great Plains a little bit. Very interesting stuff, not my forte, but we here at Penn State have a lot of articles about carbon and carbon markets and stuff. So feel free to check out our website and to go through it. We have a couple of case studies on how different landowners have interacted with carbon markets. So if you own a couple of thousand acres of land, we have case studies on that. And if you just own 40 acres, we have case studies about how small landowners are also selling carbon. And then if you guys have more questions, feel free to shoot Melissa and I an email. We're really happy to chat, unless it's about rangeland stuff, in which case I'm going to send you to somebody else, because I don't know a lot about that. But forest, I do. So we now have time for questions, if there are questions.